A German officer named Friedrich Raus, a decorated Wehrmacht veteran who had survived 4 years of war on the Eastern Front, wrote something in his post-war memoir that his superiors would never have allowed him to say in 1943. He wrote, "They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead. We had never encountered that before. Not from the British, not from the Russians, not even from the SS. He was not describing a major battle. He was not describing Normandy or the Bulge or the fall of Berlin. He was describing a single-night action on a secondary front against a unit that most of continental Europe had barely heard of. He was describing the United States Marine Corps. For decades, the story of American military excellence in World War II has been told almost exclusively from the American side through the lens of Hollywood, through the words of generals, through the monuments erected on Pacific beaches and in Norman Hedros. And in that telling, the Marines occupy a place of obvious, almost mythological supremacy. Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, the flag, the legend, but mythology by its very nature obscureth mechanism. It shows you the result without showing you the machinery that produced it. It tells you that the Marines were feared without ever asking the question that actually matters. Why? Not from the American side. Not from the memorial speeches or the recruiting posters or the film reels, but from the men who were on the other side of the wire. From the men who had to file the after-action reports in the cold language military bureaucracy. Even when what they were describing was something that defied bureaucratic language entirely. This is not a story about American victory. Victory is the conclusion. This is a story about what German officers, Japanese commanders and Axis analysts wrote, said, and confessed when they thought no one from the winning side was listening. It is the story of the US Marines told entirely through enemy testimony. And what that testimony reveals is something that even the most devoted student of military history may find surprising. It was not the weapons, it was not the numbers, it was not the training. Although the training was unlike anything the Axis had encountered from another Western power, it was something else. Something the Germans spent years trying to name and never quite could. To understand what the Germans were reacting to, we need to understand what they expected. By 1942, the Wehrmacht had been at war for 3 years. It had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6. It had pushed the British into the sea at Dunkirk. It had advanced 800 kilometers into Soviet territory in a single summer. The German military machine, by any objective measure, was the most experienced fighting force on Earth. Because of this, the German officers had developed a precise taxonomy of enemy quality. The British were disciplined but reactive, excellent in defense, predictable in offense. The Australians were aggressive but relied too heavily on individual initiative. The Soviets were what the Germans called inexhaustible, a word that concealed more fear than it admitted. The Americans, when they first arrived in significant numbers in late 1942, fit neatly into a pre-existing category. They were, in the German assessment, what the Wehrmacht called well-equipped amateurs. Generously supplied, technologically advanced, but fundamentally inexperienced men who would perform adequately until the first real shock and then break. This assessment was not contemptuous. It was clinical, and it seemed to be confirmed by the disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where American forces were routed by Rommel's Afrika Korps and lost nearly 10,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 3 days. But there was on it that had not been at Kasserine Pass, a unit operating several thousand kilometers away on islands that barely appeared on German strategic maps. And the men who encountered that unit were filing very different reports. Oberleutnant Werner Schutter, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer assigned to analyze Pacific Theater reports, wrote in an internal assessment that the American Marine infantry units display a willingness for close combat that we have not observed in other Western forces. Their junior officers attack. This is not common. 4 words, this is not common. Then, in the language of military intelligence reports, those 4 words are extraordinary. They mean, we do not have a box for this. The island of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands chain was not a place that appeared in any German strategic calculation. But the reports arriving from Japanese officers who had fought there, reports that German military attaches in Tokyo collected with professional intelligence began, arriving in Berlin by the autumn of 1942. They described something the German analysts initially assumed was Japanese exaggeration. The 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. They had secured the airfield in 2 days. The Japanese, who outnumbered the Marines in the surrounding jungle, had expected the Americans to dig in to wait for a supply, to behave as all Western forces behaved when operating at the end of a fragile supply line. Instead, the Marines had gone into the jungle. Sergeant Major Yoshio Tachibana of the Imperial Japanese Army, captured in October 1942 and interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, provided a statement shared with German military attaches as part of a routine intelligence exchange. It read, "They hunt at night. Our centuries hernothing. In the morning we find men dead who had been alive at midnight. We do not hear them. We do not see them. They are not like other Americans." The German analyst who received this report made a notation in the margin. The notation read, "Verify through additional sources. This does not correspond to our own observations of American infantry capability." He would spend the next 2 years updating that notation. Because the reports kept coming, to understand why the Marines were different, you need to understand what they were built for. Not the mythology, not the slogans, but the actual structural reality of what the Marine Corps was in 1942. The Marine Corps was not a mass army. It was too small, too selective then, and too focused on a particular kind of soldier to become what the regular army was becoming, a vast machine that processed millions of civilian men into functional infantry through standardized training. Beginning in the 1920s, Marine Corps planners had been preparing for exactly one scenario, an amphibious assault across the Pacific against fortified Japanese island positions. Everything else was secondary. This was the war they knew was coming. This was the war they designed themselves to fight. What this meant in practice was that marine training was not designed to produce adequate soldiers. It was designed to produce men who could function and attack and kill and survive in conditions that would break adequate soldiers. Major Hermann Bircher, the German-born officer who served with American forces in New Guinea and later wrote an analysis of marine training philosophy for a post-war military study, wrote, "The Marines do not train men to follow orders under fire. They train men to make decisions under fire." This is a fundamental difference. Most armies create soldiers who need leadership to function. The Marines create soldiers who function when the leadership is gone. That distinction would prove decisive in the jungle campaigns of the Pacific. In that environment, command structures break down. Officers are killed. Units lose contact with each other. The platoon, sometimes the fire team, becomes the fundamental unit of combat. In those conditions, an army trained to follow orders freezes. An army trained to decide advances. The Germans had a word for this quality. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, the practice of giving subordinate commanders an objective and trusting them to find their own way to achieve it. It was a doctrine the Wehrmacht was proud of. It was a doctrine they believed was uniquely German. Then, when they started reading the Pacific reports, some of them began to wonder. The battle that changed the German assessment was not one that made significant headlines. It was a series of night engagements on Guadalcanal in the autumn of 1942. Then, the German analysts began studying with increasing intensity because the mathematics did not add up. Japan's forces had numerical superiority through most of the campaign. They had naval supply routes that temporarily gave them the advantage in resupply. They had been fighting in jungle terrain for years. By every metric of conventional military analysis, they should have been able to claim the airfield. They could not. On the night of October 24th through 25th, 1942, Lieutenant General Misao Maruyama's forces attempted a coordinated assault on the marine perimeter at Lunga Point. Maruyama commanded approximately 3,000 soldiers. Then, the marine position was held by fewer than 300 men of Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The assault had been planned with precision. The Japanese infantry would advance in 3 waves under cover of darkness. Then, the Marines, expecting the attack, would be overwhelmed by weight of numbers before they could bring their supporting weapons to bear. The first wave hit the marine wire at approximately 2,200 hours. What the Japanese accounts describe in the next 4 hours is not a tactical defeat. It is something different, something harder to put in a report. The Marines did not simply hold their position. They called artillery fire on themselves, shells landing within meters of their own wire. A decision that requires a specific psychological composition, the ability to calculate that the risk of friendly fire is preferable to the risk of being overrun, and then to make that call calmly under assault. The second wave broke on the wire with the first still dying there. The third wave hesitated in the language of the Imperial Japanese Army. This was an almost unimaginable admission. A Japanese company commander named Captain Suzuki Masai, captured several weeks later during a separate action, said in his interrogation, "We expected Americans to be afraid of dying. They were not afraid. This we did not understand. This was the problem." A German intelligence officer reading that report underlined the last sentence. Then he wrote in the margin, in neat German cursive, "This is the only honest assessment we have received." Among the individual men who appear in enemy testimony, one name recurs with a frequency that demands examination. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone arrived in Guadalcanal in September 1942 with the 1st Marine Division. He was 25 years old, a former Army infantryman who had re-enlisted in the Marines. He was quiet, precise, and almost preternaturally calm in situations that produced visible panic in other men. On the night of October 24th, he was manning heavy machine gun positions in a sector adjacent to Puller's Line. When Japanese forces overran the guns to his left, Basilone moved through active fire to repair a disabled weapon. When ammunition ran out, he ran 300 meters through a Japanese assault to bring more. When 2 of his gunners were killed, he held the position alone, working 2 weapons alternately until the assault broke. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, but it was what the Japanese prisoners said in the months afterward that became the more interesting document. Several survivors of the October assault, interrogated separately by different officers, independently described as single American who did not stop. One prisoner, a corporal named Hayashi, told his interrogator, "We thought he was not human. We knew he must be killed, but he did not stop, so we believed he could not be killed." That testimony was transmitted to Berlin in a routine intelligence digest. A German officer headman K.L. Meyer filed an annotation. The Japanese are not prone to this kind of attribution. If their soldiers are ascribing an enemy as supernatural, something exceptional occurred. We should study this unit more carefully. They did, and the more they studied, the more a pattern emerged that defied their-existing frameworks for understanding Western military capability. By 1944, the German military intelligence operators had been collecting Pacific reports for nearly 2 years. What they had assembled was not a picture of American military excellence in general. It was a specific portrait of one institution, one culture, one method of creating soldiers. The Wehrmacht was proud of its Kampfgeist, its fighting spirit. It believed that this quality was either a cultural inheritance or the product of ideological conviction. It believed that Western democracies by their nature produced soldiers who fought adequately and broke under sustained pressure. The Marine Corps did not fit this model. General Major Fritz Bain, who had served as Raoul's chief of staff, and who wrote a post-war analysis of Allied military effectiveness at their quest of the U.S. Army Historical Division, devoted a specific section to what he called the American anomaly. He wrote that the American soldier in general did not display superior individual fighting qualities compared to the German infantryman. However, the Marine Corps represented a separate category. Their junior leadership was aggressive in a manner that was frankly surprising given the American civilian tradition. I do not have a satisfying explanation for this. 4 words again. I do not have from a man who had an explanation for almost everything. What Bolin did not have the framework to see was that the Marines had created a system for manufacturing a specific psychological type at scale. Not courage, exactly. Every army tried to cultivate courage, something more specific than courage. The willingness to decide alone in the dark when everything is going wrong that the correct answer is to attack the land of Tarawa November 20th through 23rd, 1943. 76 hours 19 Marines killed, 2,300 wounded. Of the approximately 4,600 Japanese defenders, 17 survived, not 17%, 17 men. The German analysis of Tarawa was extensive and by the standards of intelligence reporting almost agitated. Rear Admiral Kishibazaki had reportedly told his staff that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer the atoll. He made this statement with mathematical justification. The Marines took it in 3 days. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy the defenses. The assault craft hung on the reef, leaving Marinesto wade 400 meters through open water under direct fire. The casualties in the first 2 hours were staggering, and the Marines had kept going. This was the detail the German reports kept returning to. Not that the Marines were well supplied, because at Tarawa in those first catastrophic hours, none of that was true. But that Marine units whose officers had been killed continued to advance. Units that had lost half their men continued to advance. Units with no communication with command, no clear orders, no certainty about anything except the 10 meters immediately around them, continued to advance. Obusitant Friedrich von Melantin, who contributed to the post-war historical analysis, described Tarawa as the most concentrated example of offensive spirit under adverse conditions that we encountered in any theater. He continued, their losses should have produced a military paralysis. Instead, they produced an acceleration. This requires explanation beyond the framework of conventional infantry analysis. A Japanese officer, Commander Teo Sugai, survived Tarawa because he was rescued from the water after Theusland fell. In his interrogation, he said, "Marines are not soldiers. Marines say something else." The German analyst who read the translated version wrote next to it in red ink, "We agree. We do not yet know what might." February 19, 1945. Iwima 0900. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had built his defense underground. Milosoft tunnels cut into the volcanic rock hardened positions that naval gunfire could not reach. An interconnected system designed not to stop the Marines, but to kill as many as possible before the inevitable conclusion. Kuribayashi did not expect to win. He had lived in America, had traveled its cities, had felt the weight of its industrial capacity firsthand. He knew that Japan could not win the war. What he intended was to make the cost of winning so high that American will would break before American capability ran out. His logic was not irrational. It was based one very precedent from the European theatre, where high casualties had produced political pressure to negotiate. What Kuribayashi did not have in his calculation was the specific psychological architecture of the men he was facing. The Marines at Iwima took 26,000 casualties over 36 days. Nearly 7,000 killed. They took the island. Captain Samji Inui, one of Kuribayashi's staff officers who survived and was captured, told his interrogators, "We planned for American soldiers. We did not plan for men who could watch their friends die and then take another step forward. We did not know this was possible." He was not describing the Marines as superhuman. He was describing something more specific and more interesting. He was describing men who had been trained to process loss in real time, to absorb it, and to continue functioning. The flag went up on Suribachi on February 23rd. The island was not declared secure until March 26th. In those 31 days between the iconic moment and the actual conclusion, 6,200 more Marines were wounded. Another 1,200 were killed. The flag is the symbol. The 31 days after the flag are the reality. Private First Class Yorimasa Okubo, one of the 17 survivors of the Iwima garrison, told his interrogators, "Every day I thought, today they will stop. Today the cost will be too much." They did not stop. I began to believe they could not stop. That stopping was not something they were able to do. A German naval officer reviewing Pacific Theater reports wrote in an internal memorandum in April 1945, "The Marine Corps appears to be the only force in this war that consistently performs better as conditions worsen. This is inverse to all standard military modeling. We have no framework for this, we have only the data." In the late 1940s, as the wartime alliance dissolved, yesterday's enemies became tomorrow's strategic partners. A number of former German military officers were recruited by the American government to contribute to historical studies of World War II. The project produced hundreds of documents in which German generals analyzed their opponents' capabilities and the lessons of the war. In those documents, the Marine Corps appears as a recurring reference point, not always prominently, but consistently and always with a specific quality of language that distinguishes it from the language used to describe other American formations. General de Infantry Hansfeldrotter. In my view, the American Marine Corps represented a category of infantry that had no parallel in the European theater. Not the most technically skilled, but the most dangerous, by which I mean the most unpredictable. the most difficult to contain, and the most psychologically disorienting to oppose, psychologically disorienting in the vocabulary of a German general who had spent 6 years commanding men against the best soldiers in the world. This is a carefully chosen phrase. It does not mean frightening exactly. It means they made us uncertain. They made us unsure of our own calculations. They were unpredictable, not because they were chaotic, but because they operated on a logic we could not fully model. General Major Hormelin, writing separately but in language that echoes his brother Friedrich's, concluded, "The Marines consistently made choices in battle that our models predicted would fail. The choices succeeded. We revised the models. They made different choices. Those also succeeded. We concluded eventually that the problem was not our models. The problem was that they did not fight according to any model we possessed. How do you build men who perform better as conditions worsen?" The answer was not a secret. It was not classified. It was written into Marine Corps training doctrine in explicitums. The Marines did not believe that men became hard in battle. They believed men needed to be made hard before battle, so that battle itself was a familiar environment rather than a shock. The physical hardship of boot camp at Paris Island was not designed to build strong bodies. Although it did that, it was designed to simulate the psychological experience of being at the edge of your capability. To make that edge a familiar place so that when combat pushed men there, they recognized where they were. They had been there before. They knew they had not broken the last time. Colonel Merritt Edson, who commanded Marines in some of the hardest fighting on Guadalcanal, was asked after the war what he believed was the single most important factor in Marine battlefield performance. He said, "We break them before the enemy can, and then they are not afraid of being broken anymore." Agaman officer reading a translated version of this quote in a post-war study marked it with a single comment. The comment read, "Clausewitz described friction. These men removed it." Friedrich Rauss finished his memoir in 1955. He was living in a small town in Bavaria, teaching history at a gymnasium, a man who had commanded armies, and now taught teenagers about the wars he had survived. In the margins of the copy that survived in his family's possession, next to the passage about the men who came in the dark, there is a handwritten note that he apparently added years after the original was completed. The note reads, "I have thought about this for 12 years. I believe now that I described it incorrectly. They had not decided they were already dead. They had decided that being dead was acceptable. There is a difference. The man who has decided he's already dead has given up. The man who has decided that death is acceptable has freed himself. These were free men. That is what made them dangerous." That distinction between giving up and freeing oneself is the whole of it. It appears in fragment after fragment, in testimony after testimony, from the Japanese prisoners on Guadalcanal to the German analysts in their post-war offices, from the survivors of Tarawa to the men who came down from the caves of Iwo Jima. The Marines had found a way to make men free in the specific sense that ruse meant free from the calculation that stops other soldiers, free from the weight of survival as the primary objective, free to attack, because they had already resolved the question that paralysis is built on. And what the enemy testimony reveals across a decade of Pacific warfare and thousands of pages of post-war analysis is that this freedom was not a natural quality. It was not something these men were born with. It was not an accident of American culture or democratic values. It was built deliberately, systematically at Paris Island and San Diego, in the barracks, and on the obstacle courses, and in the long punishing marches before the war began. Then, the Marines decided before the war started what kind of men they needed, and then they built them. And on island after island, in the dark and in the heat and in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, those men met the enemy. And the enemy wrote down what they saw. And what they wrote down, stripped of context and patriotism and mythology, was always the same thing. We were not ready for this. We had been ready for the war. We had not been ready for